Other than Leia, I think Oola is one of the characters from Jabba's Palace that a lot of people would like to see made into a Kenner-style vintage figure, but up until now that has yet to happen, and so people have kind of been left to make their own custom versions. And I guess that's what we're going to look at today, a custom 3D printed vintage style figure. Now this one here is from Vivid Motion on Cults 3D. They have a number of 3D models that you can buy and download to print yourself. And they also sort of have a relationship, I guess, with Trash Compactor Customs on Etsy, so that if you don't have a 3D printer, you can buy a printed version from them directly. And in fact, I got this model through Trash Compactor Customs. They sent me the STL, thankfully, so I didn't even know about it. Didn't even know it existed until that point, so I appreciate that. What we're going to do today, as I said, is going to take this, which I've already printed out on, this one was on the Elegoo Saturn. Everything we're going to see today was on the Saturn, just because I happen to have my gray resin loaded in there. So my plan is to use this small scale figure as a bit of a test to see if I can fix up the joints and get it working well, and if so, I will use that same technique on a larger figure. But first of all, I want to try and just assemble this. I think, there are different opinions about whether you should paint individual parts and then assemble them, or paint after assembly. I think there's something to be said for both, but I'm gonna go ahead and put this together, I think, because I need to do some adjustments, because if you've ever watched my videos about this kind of vintage style figure, you'll know that the joints are always kind of a weak point, literally and figuratively, because they tend to break there, but also they're the part of the figure that's the most work. So let's see, this leg for sure is awful wobbly. This one seems okay, but still pretty wobbly. Let's try the arms. Also pretty loose. This one seems, well, yeah, look at that. And I imagine the head is going to be more or less the same. What I'm going to try and do, is to kind of compensate for this wobbliness using some of this stuff right here. I've never done this before, so we'll see how it goes. But this is green stuff, otherwise known as Kneadatite. A lot of people, in the wargaming world use this for sculpting custom little miniatures or add-ons to miniatures. Well, I've been using this for years and years. It's not this exact brand, but this stuff, and I like it pretty well, because once it's cured, it's kind of a plasticky texture, and it even has a little bit of rubberiness to it. And what I'm hoping is, if I take a little bit of this and just kind of put a small little bit around here in this section, maybe just a very small amount, that it'll be enough and kind of have enough friction that it'll allow this to fit in there tightly and yet still move. So we shall see. So this is what the green stuff looks like. You just cut off a little bit of this, and it's in blue and green sections here, obviously. You need to knead it with your fingers for a while until it becomes a uniform green color. And then you have around 90 minutes, I guess, to work with it. It'll get gradually harder as time passes. And after maybe a few hours, it should be completely cured. And my idea was that I would use this green stuff to make the pin just a little bit bigger, and also make the material that it's made out of have a little bit more friction. And hopefully that way I would make it so that the joints weren't so floppy. This is what I ended up with after making some adjustments and putting the green stuff on all of the limbs. And at first glance it looks pretty good, actually, and it does hold in place the way I expected it to. But I'm not sure about the long-term longevity of this, and I wasn't entirely satisfied with it in general, because I could tell that inside the joints here, if I remove the arm, it's kind of just tearing away at it as I move the joint, and I think over time it's just going to deteriorate, so I don't really recommend this approach, but it was worth a try. So I decided to change my plans a little bit in the middle of my project and go back to an approach that I've used in the past on the channel, and that is to use magnets for the articulation. Now you can see on this one here, this little Gamorrean guard, I have put magnets in all the joints. These are very small magnets, actually maybe a little too small even for this small figure, but you can see that it does work to keep the limbs attached and also allow them to move. The only kind of these small magnets I had on hand were the very small ones that I used for the Gamorrean guard, and this larger one that I'm showing here. It's not really quite big enough, I think, for a 3 3/4 inch figure, but since it's all I had on hand, I decided to go ahead and use this for Oola. I was still able to make use of the green stuff, however, because I needed to fill in these holes in the torso that are too big for the magnets that I have, and just to allow me to install the small magnets. And I think it actually worked pretty well for that purpose. But before you ask, yes, it would have absolutely have been a better idea to somehow modify the STL to receive these magnets, or maybe to get different size magnets as well. That's especially true for the larger size of Oola, which we'll be talking about in a minute. But I wanted to see if I could kind of salvage what I had already printed here. For the limbs, I just snipped off the peg that was on each limb and used a pin vise, or a handheld drill, as you see here, to make a hole big enough just for the magnet, which I then inserted and glued in place with some super glue. That is very easy to do. This part of the whole endeavor is definitely the easiest part. And here we have the finished figure with the magnetic articulation installed. I will say it didn't work out quite as well as I had hoped for these arms. They're just slightly off because I drilled the hole for the magnet in slightly the wrong position. You can see it works pretty well as articulation, and it sticks together relatively well, although you can easily remove each of the parts if you want to. If you've been watching the channel for a while, you'll know that I have 3D printed a gigantic jumbo Kenner Jabba the Hutt as a kind of centerpiece for my jumbo figures from Gentle Giant. And so I thought it would be nice to add some other characters to that lineup. And we're going to start with Oola. So I also printed out this model at a size that would be a total height of around 12 inches, so that it would go along with my other jumbo figures. And as you can see, the joints are even more floppy than the smaller version, which is not a surprise. Whenever you enlarge something like this, the tolerances get bigger, and you tend to just, end up with joints that barely function at all. I decided to go ahead and use magnets for this as well, and luckily I was able to find some old magnets that I bought for a couple other projects in the past. These are rare earth magnets like the smaller ones, and they are very powerful, I will say. They look like they'll fit more or less perfectly in here if I use some green stuff to fill in that gap there. Now, since these larger parts were printed hollow, as you tend to do with large pieces like this, I can't do the same thing that I did with the smaller solid version of the figure, so it's going to be a little bit more tricky to modify this to receive these magnets. Now, as I say, these are very strong magnets. I don't have any doubt that these will hold the limbs on without any problem. So I started by removing the pegs from each of the limbs, and in hindsight, I should have used probably a rotary tool to cut these off, because using these nippers ended up breaking off part of the arm, as you can see. But that was easy enough to fix with a little glue, and it did work better for the other limbs. They just came right off without too much problem. As you can see, it's hollow inside here, so I'm going to need to use the green stuff to build up a support structure for the magnet. So I did this for both the torso and the limbs, just trying to kind of create something that would be about the right size for the magnet to fit inside. And as it turned out, once they had cured, I found out I made it slightly too small, as these things tend to go. So I had to take my rotary tool and kind of ream it out a little bit.
Honestly, every step of this, it seemed like there was one more step that I needed to do. It turned out to be a lot more involved than I had expected. But I did eventually manage to make them more or less the right size. And then I had to glue them in. I wanted them to be nice and strong, so at first I decided to use epoxy glue. That turned out to be not a great idea because I found that when you have fairly tight tolerances here, in some cases the epoxy glue was so thick that it would kind of push the magnet back up out of the hole. And in one case, or maybe two, that sort of happened over time as it was curing and made it so that the magnet was a little bit lopsided. So I had to resort to using my rotary tool to kind of shave off a little bit of the magnet, which, I mean, you can kind of see what I'm talking about, where each step there's another step that I ended up having to take. And if I had just altered the STL to receive these magnets in the first place, this would have been so much easier. But, live and learn, I guess. So after that, I decided to use super glue instead of the epoxy glue, and that worked quite a bit better. My little pro tip here for attaching these magnets is to first put them on the limb and then push them into the torso like this, because that way you'll be sure that the polarity of the magnet is correct and you won't be pushing away the limb that you're trying to attach.
So here we have the semi-finished torso with all of the magnets embedded, and well, I could have done things better, let's just put it that way, but I think I'm relatively happy with the final product, despite it looking a little bit rough here in its unpainted form. And in particular, if we are to put on some of the limbs, you can see they just snap right on from about an inch away. Basically, they'll just zoom right over and align themselves like that, and they'll stay in place like that. So they do work as articulation, actually a lot better than they do even on the smaller versions of the figures I've done, I think. Boom. So, yeah, I'm actually really happy with this. So, I guess the next step is to prime this for painting.
I primed the parts of the large and small Oola figures in white and then went on to paint them. But before I show you that, I'd like to talk to you about today's sponsor, SKILLSHARE. SKILLSHARE is an online learning community with thousands of classes on a wide variety of topics, including fine art, design, and photography. There are no ads, and they're launching new premium classes all the time, so you're sure to find something that interests you. Recently, I've been taking the class Rekindle Your Love of M.C. Escher Tessellations by Francine Champagne. In the class, she explains some of the basic concepts behind tessellations used by artists like M.C. Escher, and then also shows you how to use the free iPad app KaleidoPaint to make your own. So that's exactly what I did. First, I tried making this pattern with Jabba and Max Rebo, which I think came out relatively well. Obviously, they're very stylized. Then I went and did the same thing with Oola. Although these don't have the complex interlocking shapes that I might like to eventually create, I think it's not a bad start. The first 1,000 people to click the link in the video description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare so you can explore your creativity.
After painting, I decided to give it a light coat of crystal clear enamel spray just to make it look a little less matte and a little bit more like it's made out of plastic like a vintage figure was. So here we have the completed vintage jumbo Oola figure, and generally speaking, I'm quite happy with how she turned out. I think the paint turned out well. We've got nice clean lines between the colors. Not a lot of, detail really in the paint job itself because it's attempting to recreate a vintage style figure. But, what is here came out well. I did struggle a little bit with the facial features just because, Kenner had kind of a distinctive style that they used for their faces. And so I had to kind of mimic that, like with the eyes here. They don't have any whites in their eyes typically. They just have kind of a curve and a little dot underneath it. I did add her mascara or whatever that is, eyeshadow there, and of course the lipstick. But yeah, I think it came out pretty well. I did rework this eye about 3 times to try and get it a little closer to uniform with the other one, and I'm finally relatively satisfied with that. The articulation works super well. Honestly, a lot better than I would have expected. I think it's because these magnets are so strong. It really functions well as articulation. But, you can, of course, take the limbs off if you want. So, yeah, I think this is going to look great on display with my jumbo vintage Jabba figure, which I'll show you in just a minute, actually. But I did want to also show you that I painted up the smaller version of the figure as well. I'm a little bit less happy with this version for a couple of reasons. I mentioned that I had some trouble with the articulation on the arms, not working right there. You can see there's a little bit of a gap, which I'm not crazy about. The paintwork on the body is fine. The face, because it's so small, is a little challenging to get perfect. But, I think it works pretty well, especially if you're going to be viewing it at a reasonable distance, a foot or two away, it'll look just fine. I will say, though, that the strength of the magnets is a little disappointing. And this, I knew that was going to happen. I knew it was not going to be super strong, but it does have a tendency to kind of fall apart a little bit more easily than I would like. But, I think it came out relatively well, all things considered. It's kind of the same size now, isn't it? In any case, let's go ahead and bring out the vintage Jumbo Jabba that I 3D printed in a video a number of months ago, and see how it looks with Oola here. So here we have my gigantic Jumbo Jabba figure that I 3D printed, and I'm just going to show you a few figures next to him to give you kind of a sense of the scale. We have Bib Fortuna, who was kind of the one that influenced the scale that I printed Jabba at the most because I wanted them to look appropriate next to each other. I intentionally made Oola a little bit shorter than him, but still 12 inches in total height. And if you compare her to other figures like C-3PO, for example, she's basically exactly the same height as them. So I think she looks completely natural in a display of Gentle Giant figures, which, it's really was my end goal here. So I'm quite happy with that. As I mentioned at the start of the video, if you want to try printing her for yourself, you can go to Vivid Motion's store on colts3d.com and get the STL file there. Or you can also buy an already printed version in the 3 3/4 inch size from Trash Compactor Customs on Etsy. The links for those are in the video description. This video was brought to you with the help of my patrons on Patreon, including Angelica Brady and these Palace VIPs right here. If you'd like to know how you could support me for as little as $1 a month, click the link in the video description. Thanks for watching.